Hi, Ann.
Hello, how are you?
I am very good, very good. So we're here with Ann. I'm Darren Smith from MBM, and for our YouTube channel and for our HBDI article, we're looking to find out more about HBDI from the lady who knows the man. So what was it like growing up with the man, Ann Herrmann?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I kind of often like to joke that I was the only kid in the neighborhood who would get wired up to the EEG after school for testing. Um, but he was really somebody who was constantly seeking and seeking answers. He was truly a scientist by nature, even though he ended up being an executive in management development. It was at times fun, at times exasperating. But I think the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Many people have told me that I remind them of him. But it was certainly a unique experience, and I wouldn't trade it in for anything. And I would say, mostly, having worked side by side with him, certainly was one of the richest experiences. And most people don't get that with their parents. Their parents are always their parents. They're not adults. And when you work with someone side by side, you have an adult to adult relationship, and that was really a thrill. So, wouldn't trade that in for anything.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, we've got a bunch of questions, some from us, some mainly and most importantly from our clients and prospects, and others from people that have written in on Twitter and so on. So we're
Great.
going to go through those questions.
Terrific.
Love to hear your answers. So we're going to start with the first one that I think everyone's going to ask is, what's your profile?
So, it's always interesting because people do seek to know that, and people who know me really well can sort of ferret it out. But so I have a triple dominant profile, a primary in the A blue quadrant, a secondary in the green B quadrant, a primary in the red C quadrant, and a primary in the yellow D quadrant. My yellow is clearly my lead preference, but followed by kind of a tie between the blue and the red, because then they kind of battle each other out on occasion as I'm making decisions. And least preferred is the green, although, situationally I go there. It's not where I get energy. It takes a lot more of my time. And thankfully I have some people around me who provide me with some of that support. But yeah, so I'm a 1-2-1-1.
Okay, 1-2-1-1. That's, well, I can understand that. Green is my least favourite too. An organisation drives me insane. But, not about you and I. All right. Let's find out a little bit more about you. We're each of our training courses is after a film, so I just wanted to find out, what's your favourite film and why?
Oh gosh, that's a really tough question. I've been asked this question many times. So it evolves, okay, over time. So right now, at this very moment, it's kind of a classic film that might surprise some, and it will certainly date me. It's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And the reason is because I've been really interested in artificial intelligence for some time. I just got back from a conference at MIT on artificial intelligence and the future of work, and was reminded of how powerful that film was. At the time it seemed, now they had the date a bit wrong, right? 2001 was not quite the right date, right?
Not
But
quite.
it seemed kind of unbelievable at the time, and it's actually coming true. So I found myself thinking back to and wanting to watch again, and so on and so forth. So I hadn't actually thought of that film for some time, but it had been a favorite for many, many years. So currently, that's what is top of mind when you ask me that question today.
And if we were to stretch your blue a bit and ask you to put a date on the film, what do you think the right date would have been? Not 2001, but...
I think it was 68. No, I think it was in 1968, I think. I don't know, maybe. I know I was pretty young, so I don't know, but I could be wrong. But I think it was probably 68.
All right. We do a lot of training with clients who want to understand HBDI, and then they get to this point where they're sort of, I want to be more green. I wish I could be more green and more blue. So let's stick with green for a moment. If one of our learners says to us, I want to be more green, what would your advice be?
Well, first and foremost, it's always interesting to me, this idea of, I want to be more of, right? It's almost like, can I claim more of that profile space? And it's not about increasing your preference so much, unless you really are struggling with having any ability to feel like you can access that kind of mental processing at all. For most people, it's making friends with that quadrant. And I have found that that if you're struggling with a given area, one of the best ways to develop skills and competencies, which we're not measuring with the HBDI, but one of the best ways to measure skills and to create skills and competencies in terms of a lesser preferred thinking quadrant, is to do that work in service of a preferred quadrant. So let me give you an example. We had a consultant who worked with us for many years, who had a pretty low preference. I think it was even a tertiary, a 3 preference, and it happened to be in the green. And he on the weekends, one of his hobbies was sailing. You better believe that as he got ready for a big sail, he was extremely organized. So he found a way to get very, very organized, be very planful, be very detailed, when he knew, first of all, it was something he loved to do. Second of all, his life kind of depended on it, and a few other things. So what I often recommend to people is find something that you really love to do, and then develop skills and competencies in your area of lesser preference in service of that activity that you love.
Yes, yes.
And what it does is it frees you up to sort of say to yourself, well, let me make friends with that, because it's a means to an end. It's not an end into itself. And where I think people get very frustrated was when they think, well, I just have to, in the case of the green preference, well, I've got to get organized because I'm supposed to be organized. Well, that's not going to give you much motivation. Whereas if it's somebody who is scuba diving and they have a low preference in blue, they might get really interested in the technology. They might get really interested in the gear. They might find out ways to understand some of the science behind it. So it's a way to kind of flip it so that it's a mind hack, really, to be able to, kind of free up some energy and some motivation to do that work, because it may be harder to develop skills and competencies in an area of lower preference, but it's doable.
I like that. I like that. So let me put you on the spot. So green is your lowest preference. Have you got one of those hacks that you're doing?
Yeah, actually, so, I'll give you a quick example. I'm leaving for China on Wednesday.
Yep.
I have, I believe, 7 presentations in 7 days to like 5 different audiences, including a keynote in front of 1,000 people, and work with practitioners and CEO presentations. I mean, it's all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm really excited about this trip. I'm very excited because it's promoting the book that just got translated into Chinese. So having the Whole Brain Business book, even see my name in Chinese, etc. It's fun.
Lovely.
So but it requires a tremendous amount of preparation and organization to get ready for this trip. So every time I feel that sort of mental wall, it's like, oh God, I've got to do this. And what I do is I actually just visualize myself, because I'm a quite visual person, visualize myself really just being on site and enjoying the moment of that given presentation. And that sort of gets me out of that mode of getting all caught up in the actual task of organization, and puts me back to the why I'm doing it. So, visualization is one of the techniques that I use as a mind hack. I visualize the task that's done. I visualize the state that I'm in when it's done, and it helps me sort of mind hack my way through it.
Fabulous. All right, I like that a lot. Okay. So we used to do something where we used to get the 4 different groups in 4 corners of the room, and we used to say to them, who alphabetizes their CD sections. The greens always put their hands up. And the reds say, oh, maybe we ought to do that. But they'd never get to it because it was boring. So they thought it was boring.
And by the way, I'll just say, we tend to, one thing I prefer to do is to say, those with green preferences and those with red preferences, rather than referring to people as greens and reds and blues and yellows, because they do can turn into sort of a, planet from outer space if we start talking about people in terms of colors. So I usually really encourage people to say, those with a green preference or a gray, because we do have all four, right? And so we're not just one or the other. So just a quick reminder there, just prefer to do that. For those who may not be as familiar with the model, we're not talking about Martians. We're not talking about, right? We're talking about people who've got a strong primary preference. And like me, I have multiple primary preferences, so.
Okay. And let me just add another one in. Ned, what profile was he? Which profile?
Yeah, so he had a similar profile to mine. His was a 1-2-2-1, so primaries in the upper left blue A quadrant and upper right yellow D quadrant. Over the course of the last part of his life, though, even though he didn't have a strong preference in the red, he began to sort of develop greater comfort with that particular quadrant, but he had a typical physicist profile.
All right. Fair enough. We couldn't go without mentioning MBTI. So it's one of the largest, if not the largest, personality tests. And we get a lot of challenge from clients saying, we ought to use that one. It's the most popular. So what would your thoughts be on why HBDI rather than MBTI if you had to pick one?
So I guess I'll premise this by saying, first and foremost, I don't, this notion of, well, this versus that, they're different. Okay, so we're measuring different things. And I think a lot of it has to do with what you're trying to achieve with an assessment. One thing to understand is, well, why are they different? One of the things that's really important to understand is that the Myers-Briggs type indicator comes out of type theory, understanding the psychology of what's going on in your head. And so the premise is psychological. The premise of the HBDI is cognitive. Now, there's going to be overlap between those two things, but because they're both internal, but they're going to tell you different things. And so, what I have found actually, which is really interesting, is that for organizations who are using the Myers-Briggs type indicator, they often find that using the Herrmann as a follow-up or in parallel to that works really well, because it allows them to get two different perspectives on the same person. And with some sense of confirmation, because the data doesn't contradict. What the Herrmann will do is allow you to really understand how you're thinking. So our focus is all about thinking, and then how that thinking then translates obviously into behaviors and the way we look at the world. And because of that, and because of the nature of the brain, it's quite situational. And we know that we have access to all four thinking preferences, and that the brain is plastic in nature. In other words, our thinking can change. So it's really a very different premise. It's a very different type of model. It's very easy to understand. You don't have to understand 16 types. It's visual, so you very quickly grasp what it is. It's extremely easy to apply. But I will rarely say to somebody, well, gosh, don't use Myers-Briggs, because Myers-Briggs has its place. It's obviously widely appreciated by a whole lot of people out there. It just gives you different data and delivers it in a very different way. And together, they're extremely powerful. But if you want to understand how somebody thinks, solves problems, makes decisions, tends to communicate, kind of where their thinking goes first, then the Herrmann is the best assessment to use. And so much of our world today is about thinking. So that's why I think so many people really appreciate it, and especially in a business environment.
We certainly prefer it here. What we found with clients and prospects is that they grab hold of it more simply, more quickly, because it's simpler.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, rather than 16 preferences, there are 4. So, okay, all right, agree. We often are with new teams of people, and they've just got hold of HBDI, and they've sort of got past that bit of, okay, this is my preference, this is my profile, and they want to operate better as a team. What would be your top tips? So they've just got HBDI, 7 people trying to work better as a team. What do they do?
So there are a few things that I strongly recommend for teams. First and foremost, don't stop at just looking at the data and saying, oh, I'm a this, you're a that, right? Really, the power of the HBDI, in my view, is to give people a framework around which to get context around another person. So I often recommend that teams take the time to sit down and talk about the context of their data. How did they get there? And what that does is it reveals and gives empathy for the other people on the team, more about that person as a whole, and kind of what led up to that thinking preference. So that's a very powerful activity that I think can really, really help teams go beyond a sort of simplistic, oh, well, you've got stronger preferences in red, you've got stronger preferences in blue, and kind of, having only a sort of a superficial piece. The other thing I strongly recommend is that they actually do an analysis using the HBDI team profile. And in the HBDI team profile, you get a process flow, which shows the collective preferences of the group from most to second most, third most, and least. And a great best practice is to actually run your meetings in the reverse order of the process flow. To start with the group's least preferred, and then work backwards towards the most preferred, to see exactly how that impacts the team dynamics. And what it can do is it gets everybody sort of jostled out of their normal kind of thinking, sometimes rut. It gives them a very interesting way to come into a meeting with a different perspective. And then as they get more comfortable with that, a group of engineers some years ago was just not thinking about the customer. The customer they ran out of time in their meetings before they talked about the customer. So what they did was they flipped it. That was their least preferred. They started every team meeting talking about the customer in the red and their stakeholders. And it really dramatically changed the output of the team and their ability to embrace something that was not a strong preference for anybody, but it was allowed them to actually bridge that gap. As we know, everybody can actually shift their thinking. Yeah. And I'd say finally, I think that teams need to take the initiative to keep the language alive, so that it becomes a way to sort of a shortcut, not only for how you and I think, but how we might be looking at a task. So, you can use the language to say, we're in the process of doing this work, the strategic work, let's bring in more yellow thinking. Or, we've completely overlooked this particular aspect and this data, so we've got to really shift to blue. And so use it as a process language, not just a language to describe the individuals in the group. And teams that do that do really well. They get a lot of yield out of learning about the data.
Okay. Those last two bits I completely get. The first bit I just want to come back to a couple of minutes ago when you said we need to understand where it's come from. Can you just give me a practical understanding of what you would do or ask that group to do?
Sure. So, what's interesting is let me just ask you this question. I'll put you back on the spot there, Darren. So when you think about your profile and the influences in your life that led you to having that profile today, you could probably think of a few influences, maybe growing up, maybe your early career, maybe what you did at school, maybe. So what it does is it opens up a conversation about the broader view of you, and gives people a way to think about you. It's really a trigger for you to share context, irrespective of what that context is. Right? So can you think of an influence or two that might have led you to the profile that you have today?
Well, I guess I can only think of one at the moment in the absolute negative. So we used to sit in French lessons, and we sat in a French lesson, and every French lesson for double French, which was 2.5 hours, they'd throw irregular verb book at us and ask us to learn it. Now, I'm not sure if that's more about my learning style or my HBDI preference, but I hated it. I could not learn that way. It was just a bunch of facts that weren't going in. And I wanted to live it and breathe it and use it. And actually, I might have been very good at French had we been taught in a very different way. Maybe that was a preference. I don't know.
So so for me, that says, perhaps that gave you a sense of frustration with that type of learning. But as you think about the different educational choices that you made, how did they reinforce what your preference has been? How did they, so I think, again, just sharing that bit of information about your past gives me context for you. So using the HBDI as a trigger for conversation about who I am is a very powerful way to use it. And it's a catalyst, I believe, for most organizations and individuals and teams that are using this really well. it's a catalyst for talking about life, about process, about what we're here to do. It's not just my data. And so I think to me, using it as a catalyst to learn more about what's going on is really its true power.
I like that. What I've taken from that is bringing that profile to life for someone. I
Yes.
get that as I grew up. Lovely, lovely. All right. Well, there's one yellow to another. My question's probably obvious, but I wanted to ask, where do you see it going in the future? HBDI, whole brain thinking, where's it going?
Well, I don't think I've been as excited about what we're doing as I am today. So it's interesting. I mentioned I just got back from the MIT conference on artificial intelligence and the future of work. And because we're in the cognitive space, we're looking at a whole new set of research opportunities that have to do with how do we make sure that human intelligence keeps up with machine intelligence, and understanding that we can create through an understanding of how we use technology, how we think and process information, how we can bridge the gap. We've got a whole lot of new tools in the pipeline that we'll be launching in 2018. We have a new platform that is going to allow us to create a whole new array of assessments that and toolkits that will allow those who are thinkers, as we like to refer to them, those who are getting their HBDI data, to better understand it, learn it in a variety of different ways, apply it, get reinforcement for it, be able to get an email once a month to kind of prompt their thinking about it, and share their profile, etc. So we have a new product called the Team Dashboard that is a terrific tool for teams to begin to understand not only what their preferences are through the actual HBDI team profile, but then how does that play itself out in terms of where the team is headed, and how does the team think about where they want to be. So that's just an example. And we also have some really interesting and creative tools that we're working on. We have a bot for Slack that reminds you of your HBDI profile. Slack, which is a platform that many people use. So a lot in the pipeline. I'm really excited about where we're headed.
Wow. Lovely. Okay. One of the other questions we tend to get when we're handing out profiles and then ready to discuss it with, as we call them, a bunch of learners, is why do you do that right hand, left hand hobbies thing? The same questions that you ask. So we've looked it up, we understand the answers, but I'd like to hear from you. Why are you asking about right hand, left hand, and these other things?
Okay, so just to step back for a moment in terms of the origin of the HBDI. Again, it was not developed by a classic psychometrician. You'll note that a lot of assessments have the same type of question throughout. Yeah. And it's just the same thing, right? One of the things that differentiates HBDI quite a bit from other assessments is the fact that it has several different question types, quite a few as a matter of fact, which actually makes it a little more interesting to complete, I think, for many people. Some of those questions are research-oriented questions. Some of them are driving to get preference clues that we can derive from the answers to the questions, and those are actually going to continue to evolve. Our new platform is going to allow us to continue to tweak some of those questions, add questions, drop questions, etc. And so some of the questions are on there for research purposes. So the handedness question was an early question on the assessment, trying to eke out if there was indeed a correlation between handedness and thinking preference. And we probably have more handedness data than anybody else on the planet, especially since we asked the question about pencil position. So we understand the mental processing associated with the way we hold a pen or pencil. And that is really, at this point, only really for our ongoing research. As we look at things like hobbies, hobbies provide us with a different set of clues. We're not just who we are at work, and we're not just kind of how we describe ourselves. Some of the activities that we choose to pursue give us clues about how we think and the kinds of things that we're interested in. So again, there's a wide array of questions because they give us a variety of answers to really talk to us about the whole person. So some of them are completely research oriented, others are related to the preference data that we provide. And you'll see that we're with the new, we have a new HBDI digital profile, which streamlines the reports and gives you data that may or may not include some of the data points that are related to those questions, since those that are research related will probably not appear on the report as a way to just kind of simplify the thinker experience. But we're a research organization, so we ask research questions.
Fair enough, fair enough. Well, just tell us a little bit more about the motion sickness one. That's the one that people tend to ask most about.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh, the people who ask about it, the people who get motion sickness typically. And motion sickness as a single variable was a question early on. It's a research question to understand if there was a correlation between thinking preference and motion sickness. And as a single variable, you would see a much higher frequency of motion sickness with artists than you would with accountants.
Yep.
So it was kind of like, could there be a correlation here? What we found is that it's absolutely not predictive. Those who experience a high degree of motion sickness will say that they don't experience when they feel like they're in control. For example, when they're driving, if they're holding onto the steering wheel, they align themselves with the horizon and they're focused on what's in front of them, and they're in control. Their inner ear and their visual input is all in control and aligned. When they're in the back seat of the car and they're reading and there's stuff happening around them, the sides and so on and so forth, that creates confusion between the inner ear and the visual input, and they feel that nausea. My dad used to joke, well, accountants don't throw up even when the numbers are really bad. But it's really, again, a research question. So for those people who are interested, it's not at all going to predict their thinking preference. It's not going to impact their thinking preference. It's really just for ongoing research. What I do recommend for people, though, who do experience that motion sickness is that notion of finding a way to feel like they can control and align those two perspectives helps them. And that's a lot of what people talk about in terms of dealing with motion sickness. If you're on a boat, align with try to align with the horizon, that kind of thing.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Much better answer than we give. So I may play that back to them. All right, so someone's just got their HBDI, they've taken off the sticker, they've opened it, they've got their profile, and we've talked to them about it a bit. What would your advice be to them so that they can bring most out their profile? They've read it and they're starting to get it.
So I usually, there's a journey that I usually recommend that makes a lot of sense. And it's a naturally occurring journey for most people who get their profile. So first and foremost, it starts with you. And it's really thinking about, okay, how is this impacting me in my own head? What are the things that I tend to do when I'm looking at making decisions, or the way I'm solving problems, or the way I'm looking at communication? Where does my thinking go, and how's that working for me? And so it's really that sort of me within me kind of zone, right? And that's really where it all starts. And you really kind of have to start there, because if you don't understand yourself at that level and have that self-awareness, then you're not really ready to extrapolate it with others. The next phase for me is to then look at me and you. All right. And so you then begin to understand the context of your data. Then I look at your data and I say, okay, let's understand how this begins to impact my interaction with someone who has similar or different preferences. How does that work for me? What might be the implications? And picking a few people that are really important to you, both personal and professional. I usually recommend that you do both. Lots of times at home, we have somebody with a very different preference that we might live with. So we can practice every single day, improving our connection point and enjoying the differences that are there. We worked with a couple some years ago where we did a live TV show where they were discovering their profiles on TV. He was a plastic surgeon. She was an artist or an art collector. And as you were interviewing them, it was hysterical. She would say things like, he occasionally tells me he should be picking out the art, right? And he'll say, well, and I talked to her about our finances, but right? And they delighted in their differences. So one of the things that is a big aha for most people is, how do I get beyond that sort of frustration that comes from difference to really an appreciation for how that may complete my perspective, provide me with a very important, different perspective, etc. And then you can extrapolate that out beyond just me and you to me and the team or me and the family, and what that group dynamic looks like, and how do those. And again, as you get more fluent with the language, it's easier for you to then kind of work with it, just like learning French. You get more fluent, and so it allows you to better navigate a group dynamic. And then how about you and your organization? What are the implications in terms of culture, in terms of your customers, in terms of the processes you're using? And then finally, how about you and your world at large? So that journey of me to me, plus me and you, me and the team, me and my organization, and me and the world is really, I think, one that makes a lot of sense for people. It's not always linear, but it can be very useful to look at those different categories along the path, and it gives people a way to continue to kind of go deeper.
Lovely, lovely. And a side question: do you see organisations as having a thinking preference? So a company might come across as more blue or more red or more.
Sure. Well, obviously, when you look at culture, you can diagnose culture as using the model as a diagnostic tool to sort of describe the way a company culture might be, and that typically comes from an array of things: the type of industry, the type of product, and it's rarely the collective preference of everyone in the company, because when you look at companies as a whole, you'll tend to see that they have got a distribution of preference across all four quadrants because of the numbers of people that are in there. But as you think about different companies, you can pretty easily pick up, where does the focus, attention, and energy go? What is most highly regarded in terms of the thinking in that company? So, you can use the model as a way to describe a company culture, but you have to be careful to not describe it in such a way that you're implying that everybody who works in that company has that preference, because that's certainly not ever going to be the case. No,
that's fair. So we might describe FedEx as probably green and Apple maybe as yellow, but not everyone in that business of.
Right.
All right. So I've got my profile. I've taken your advice. I'm now 6 months further on. I've got some questions. I've got some ideas. How do I take it further now? I'm 6 months into using stuff.
Well, I guess one of the things that I often encourage people to do is have a stop and think moment. And so one of the things I like to teach as part of where I believe, many organizations are asking us today about how they can be more agile, and how their thinking can be more agile, and how their leaders can be more agile. And one of the best ways to become more agile is to become excruciatingly aware of where your thinking goes in different situations, right? And I like to define thinking agility as having that ability to situationally and deliberately and consciously shift your thinking as a given circumstance requires it. Right. So how do you very deliberately and consciously shift your thinking? That requires, and I found that in many instances, about 6 months in, I've got the language down. Maybe I've kind of worked it through from my own head, sort of thought about it. I thought about maybe a specific relationship, maybe worked on my team, maybe even shared this with my family. But those who really take it to the next level, take moments throughout the course of their day to stop and think about their thinking, and to use the model as a prompt to do that. And so as they're navigating a given situation, rather than just letting their brain, which the brain will do, just proceed as it normally would by default, it's taking a stop and think moment, doing a whole brain walk around, so visiting each of the quadrants mentally, and then asking themselves, where does my thinking really need to be to best serve this situation? And becoming as skilled and as agile as you can be. It's like building that flex muscle, just like you would at the gym. But it takes quite a bit of conscious, deliberate attention to stop and think about your thinking. And I believe it's even harder in today's environment than it's ever been, just because of the constant flow of information coming in at us. So that notion of a stop and think moment, and then really working on your thinking agility so that you can best really use this operating system that you have in your head to do what you want it to do and what it needs to do versus what it might just do of its own volition. And so I would have a stop and think moment at 6 months. How have I really used this? Am I really just doing what I did before with new labels, or have I really optimized my thinking in a way that allows me to do something better? And it's useful if you pick a certain application, maybe it's decision making, communication, whatever, and you just work on that. And you may find that if you're an intuitive decision maker, maybe you overlook certain aspects of a decision. So practice all week long, doing that. It might surprise you that I'm a very visual thinker myself, but I found that I was actually not having as much visual input in my life, and I sort of felt like my visual thinking was starting to atrophy. So I've actually spent quite a bit of time doing photography, and I take 30 minutes a day to think visually, and it's actually impacted the way I really look at the world, because I felt like I needed to stretch that muscle, even though it is a preference. So, whatever it might be for you in the given circumstance.
So if I would take a practical example, it might be, let's see, we're 2:45 here, so 3 o'clock in the UK, all meetings are happening. The 3 o'clock meeting, and someone might always think of the yellow preference and bring lots of ideas. But I think what you're suggesting is maybe they move into the red quadrant, and maybe they're thinking more about the people as they go into that meeting.
Absolutely, and using taking a stop and think moment to just stop and think about your thinking, so you can be more deliberate and conscious about how you're using this operating system.
Okay. All right. And so we've done the person who's just got their profile. We've talked about the person who's 6 months in. What about the old hand? I mean, I particularly have been using HBDI for about 15 years. Some of our clients have been using it lots of years. So what direction would you point us in to maybe refresh our thinking or to challenge our thinking?
Well, first and foremost, if it's been that long, take your profile again and see if it's changed. I think some people think, oh, well, this is it for life. But, not necessarily. We all change throughout the course of our lives, and you may actually see a shift in your profile. And so, I think it can be very useful. And one of the things that we're recommending, since we have a new digital profile and it's got a very different display, is that people revisit their profile and they can kind of think of, have I changed my mind lately? Do a side-by-side comparison and see what might have evolved in terms of your thinking, and then why.
Yeah.
And have a moment to take a look at that. The other thing I find is that people get into sort of an application rut. Whatever application you started with, maybe it's Teams, maybe it's career development, maybe it's communication, whatever it is, could be sales. Whatever that application focus was in the beginning, and we know our brains do that, tends to kind of be the road that they travel with it.
Yeah.
So what I often recommend is to pick an application that you would never typically use this for. For some people, that might mean, I'm going to use it in my personal life. For other people, it might mean, I'm going to do something like I did, like I'm going to go outside and do an activity that has nothing to do with work. And revisit it within the context of that application. Sort of change up your application context. One organization that did a terrific job of this, Perfetti Van Mel, they, produce Mentos, which is a very popular product here in the U.S. Actually were able to apply this to their wellness initiative. They looked at it from a management development perspective. They looked at it from a sales perspective. They looked at it from a wide array of different application contexts. So that's how they kept it alive. And I think that it's very easy to get into a sort of an application rut. And whatever application rut you're in, switch it up and revisit where you're at, both personally and from an application perspective.
Okay. Fabulous. We did a little amount of work with Perfetti Van Mel in the UK. Nothing on HBDI yet, but okay.
Good.
All right. We wanted to find out a little something about you, because we'll ask a lot of questions that other people will. But one of the questions we wanted to ask is, what's something about you that few people know?
It's a few people. Well, I actually, you brought up French earlier. I lived in France for 15 years. So I am a Francophile, so to speak. I could help you with your French. Yeah. As part of my life over there, I was actually a programmer for a few years. So I was an assembler programmer way back when. And so, yeah, most people don't know about the programming piece at all. So a lot of people know about the the EEG kind of wiring up thing, because I tell that story quite a bit, and I actually tell the story in a TEDx talk I did, which I highly recommend to people if they're looking for a way to share the story. It's called The One Thing You Know About Your Brain. You need to know about your brain that will change your life.
One thing you know, okay, yeah.
The one thing you need to know about your brain that will change your life, which is it's a great way to sort of introduce the model with some of the stories and to a very broad audience. Also did another TEDx talk that is all about thinking about the future, and it's think like your future depends on it, because it does, is the title of that one. And it's all about what you need to do to prepare for your future. And it's a very personal story from me, and sharing some insights from some work that my father did and that led to the development of this work. Two opportunities there. And both of those were very interesting presentations. It's interesting to do that format. So,
well, I'll add those links to this and watch them myself. Okay. All right. Well, we've just got a few more minutes with you, so I'm going to ask you the last couple of questions. The validation of the tool. I've read a lot about the validation of this tool versus Mbita and others. And if I'm honest, a lot of it goes over my head. Can you make it simple for us? Is the HBDI tool validated, and if so, how?
Sure. So from a psychometric perspective, and lots of times validation, that's what it's referring back to. Basically, validity is looking at, does the assessment actually measure what it purports to measure? And, is it doing what it says it's going to do? And does it do so reliably? Right? It's really, in essence, what validation is. And when we look at the dimensions of these four thinking preferences as they relate to each other, what we are purporting to measure, we measure thinking preferences, and it does so reliably. So yes, it is a well-validated assessment. But also another aspect of validity is face validity, and that is when people see their profile, does it resonate with them and say, this pretty much fits me. Okay. And the face validity is quite strong on the HBDI as well. So there's different forms of validity, but those are two that I think are most relevant for most people. So yes, the validity is solid. And we continue to do ongoing research and work as we evolve that will continue to demonstrate that.
Okay. Thank you. Last question. So we're talking to a bunch of teams, they understand their profile, and whilst we shouldn't pigeonhole people, I understand. To begin with, it helps them understand you have a preference more for green or for blue. We're trying to think about some practical applications in the office. Have you seen any company implement something very well that says, here's my profile, so when I phone you or when I talk to you, I can instantly see this is who you are?
Sure. So ranging from there's a college football team that I won't mention because they think this as a competitive advantage. It's been using this for some time to basically turn around the results of the team. And when you walk around the locker room and all of that area, you see that people's profiles are everywhere on the wall, posted. You go into the different team rooms, the offensive team, defensive team, etc. And they use it as a way to constantly remind themselves of how, if you understand how your teammate is thinking, you can make that split-second difference in terms of communicating with them on the field. I'm just having it. So if you're in a co-located space and you can actually have your profile available and in front of you at most times, I think that's very useful. Many people use our desk flip tool, and have their profile sitting kind of available to others on their desk, which is it's a small little model display, which is very, very practical and useful, and has 8 or so models that you can refer to, and you can slide your mini profile in there. And that way it's kind of like, you know, hey, this reminder that this is kind of how I'm thinking is also as a way for me to remind myself. But as I mentioned, we have the Slack bot that reminds you of what your preferences are and what others' preferences are. So you can put your HBDI in there. We also have on the app a way for people to share their profile very easily on Twitter, on Facebook. So if you haven't downloaded the HBDI app, and if you're not using the app, strongly recommend that you do that. And you can email it to someone. You can upload it to different forms of social media. And we're going to continue to find ways to help people make this ever present in their day-to-day work lives. But I'd say those that really use it to its full potential are those that keep it top of mind, that are open about sharing it with others, and then find extremely practical ways to use it. It's really not just about you, although, you know, many people think it is. It's really about how do you get the most out of this system and the collective value of all the brains in the organization. And so it's really about being very intentional and deliberate, having those stop and think moments, recognizing that irrespective of the preferences out there, that we need to be actually accessing all 4 thinking, you know, modes at any given moment to really ensure that we're covering all of our bases. And when organizations do that, you really see results improve. You've got just all sorts of examples that show, you know, a dramatic difference, both at the individual, team, and organizational level.
I've seen those case studies. You've got a lot of case studies on your website showing those, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. We've grilled you intently for 45 minutes.
Longer than planned, right?
Thank you very much. I know you're off to China, so best of luck with that.
Thank you.
There's a couple of people there that might be interested.
Yes, our partners there are very excited about it.
Well, we wish you luck with that, and big success for the future. Wow, sounds like there's some exciting developments coming up.
Well, there are, and I hope to be in London. You know, our innovation center is based in London, so hope to get over there, and so perhaps we can connect in the future. But thanks so much for our time today.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.